Welcome. Thanks for joining us again. I'm sure working from home now seems like the normal, although if you're anything like me, the cabin fever is really starting to set in now. But of course, we're doing it for the right reasons. So UHY, we're here to support our clients as much as we can, hence why we're doing these webinars, because we have to do everything virtually because we're working from home. We've seen our clients make some tough decisions this week with regards to their workforce. And the coronavirus job retention scheme has been great support to those businesses that want to protect their employees. It's been confusing. The legislation is yet to be finalised. The government's releasing updates that have done over the weekend, and it can be quite hard to understand what you should and shouldn't be doing. For today, I'm joined with HR experts. So I've got Emma Williams, she's MD of HR Service Centre, and Leslie Saunders, who's the Director of HR Service Centre. So HR Service Centre is a HR consultancy specialising in outsourced HR for small and medium-sized businesses. They cover everything from contracts of employment to specialist advice and restructuring and redundancies. So today we're going to talk about an overview of the job retention scheme and the recent updates that happened over the weekend. We're then going to open the floor for questions. During the registration process, we asked for questions in advance, and we've got quite a few that actually did come in, so we'll make sure we'll cover those best we can. If we don't get around to your question, I'm sure we'll do that in the follow-up as well, so don't worry. So I'm now going to hand over to Emma, who's going to do a quick overview of the coronavirus job retention scheme and the updates that happened over the weekend. So over to you, Emma.
Thank you, Marie. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us on today's webinar. So over the past few weeks, employers have been getting to grips with the furlough leave scheme, and today's webinar looks at where we are now and the latest guidance that was issued over the weekend and has clarified some of the matters that were previously a bit of a grey area. There's still some areas that are not quite as clear as they could be, but we'll cover what the regulations have explained so far, and then we'll deal with some questions and answers at the end. So let's recap what we know so far about the scheme. For those not familiar with the terminology, the CJRS stands for the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, and it was announced by the government mid-March to help businesses who were suffering economically as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. We do know now that it applies to all UK businesses, but they must have a PAYE reference prior to the 28th of February, and they must have a UK bank account. It does not apply to self-employed individuals, unfortunately, and the Chancellor has announced a raft of measures to support the self-employed people, but that's not the subject of today's webinar, so we're just going to look at the CJRS scheme that applies to employees. So if there's no work for the employee to do, they can be furloughed, and that has to be with their agreement, and that has to be in writing. And once you have the agreement, you can pay them 80% of normal pay, which is capped at the 2,500 rate. They must have been employed by you before the 28th of February, otherwise they're not eligible for the furlough scheme, unfortunately, and that has caused a lot of hardship for people who have either been made redundant before the job scheme was announced, or who voluntarily left their employment to go to a new employer, only to have the scheme or have their job postponed or delayed, and then they've fallen in the gap in the middle. So So what's new? Let's have a little look. So the latest guidance has said that employees can now work for another employer during a period of furlough leave, and they wouldn't have to pay back the 80% of pay. So this was a change from the previous guidance on the 27th of March that indicated that people would not be able to work for another employer. However, if your contract of employment says that you do not allow your employees to have a second job, or to work for another employer without your permission, this scheme does not replace that contractual clause. So if the clause is in your contract that they cannot work for somebody else, they would still need your permission to do that. All that the guidance is saying, the government guidance is saying, is that they will not stand in the way of employees who want to get a second job and potentially a second line of income whilst on furlough leave. It's also clarified that staff who are off sick or self-isolating will continue to receive that SSP entitlement, but they can be placed on furlough leave once the sickness ends. And also, rather helpfully, they clarified that staff who are at home and having to shield for 12 weeks can be placed on furlough leave. So that's your vulnerable group of employees who have perhaps a long-term condition. They are not prevented from being furloughed as a result of being at home and shielding. There's some clarity around what happens to pregnant employees. And they can be furloughed up to the point that they start their maternity leave, and then they will go on to receive their normal maternity leave and benefits as usual. So they would go on to their SMP and start their 12 months maternity leave. And also some guidance around apprentices and those on fixed-term contracts. The new guidance has also clarified that they too can be furloughed as part of this process, and that wasn't particularly clear before, but it is now. So there are some other developments as well, and the guidance has said if you personally employ staff under a PAY scheme, so if you employ nannies or housekeepers or gardeners, they can also be furloughed as long as they are PAYE. Obviously, if you pay them cash, which you're not meant to, you won't be able to reclaim that through the HMRC portal. And the category of employees has been expanded. So now company directors, salaried members of an LLP, LIM workers and office holders are now able to apply for furlough leave and pay, but only for the PAYE part of their remuneration, not the dividend payments. Before, it wasn't clear that company directors could continue or could take advantage of the furlough scheme rather, but now they can. If they do decide to take advantage of the furlough scheme, then they are only limited to doing statutory duties. There's not a lot of statutory duties or clarification around that, but presumably it's things like submitting returns to Companies House and things like that. There was a question mark around what does normal pay or what will earnings consist of, and the previous guidance said that commission, fees and overtime would not be included in the furlough payments, but that's been changed over the weekend, and the government have now said that earnings can include compulsory commission and past overtime, and I think the terminology is slightly inaccurate there. What I believe they mean is the contractual commission scheme and guaranteed overtime where it is provided for in the contract of employment. So it still will not include things like tips or non-contractual bonuses or commission, non-cash payments or benefits in kind. But for example, where employees have a low basic and earn commission as part of their contractual earnings, you will be allowed to take that into account, and you'll be able to average it over the previous 12 months or use the same amount as in April last year. And that's the average earnings calculation that's been clarified there and the last bullet point on the slide. You also need to keep those records for 5 years. So if you have agreed a period of furlough leave, you must keep a written record now, and that was new in the guidance over the weekend. Before, it didn't clarify whether it was verbal or written, but now it has to be kept in writing, and you must keep it for 5 years. And presumably that's an anti-fraud measure introduced for the HMRC. So some clarification around what happens if employees want to do some training or they want to volunteer. If they are carrying out training for the purposes of their employment, you must pay them at least the national minimum wage, but it is not included under the furlough scheme. The national minimum wage increased yesterday, and we can provide some guidance on what those new rates are, but also they're freely available on the .gov website. So volunteering and training is perfectly acceptable under the furlough scheme. The government's also clarified how long an employee can be furloughed for, and the minimum time for that is 3 weeks. So, but interestingly, employees can be furloughed for more than one period. So that allows employers to rotate employees now. So you can have an employee on furlough leave for 3 weeks, take them off furlough leave and put another employee on, so that the burden of the furlough leave is shared equally among employees. It has to be for a minimum of 3 weeks. So if you bring somebody back to work earlier than the 3-week limit, you wouldn't be able to claim those earnings back from the government. But of course, you can re-employ them and pay them at your own cost. The furlough leave scheme is only up to the end of May at the moment. So if you haven't started your furlough scheme yet, but you're about to, you won't be able to claim it from the point before that you put the staff on furlough leave. You can only claim it from the point onwards. So we're now into April, so therefore we have only 2 months left of the 3-month scheme that the government announced. And also company directors from your own personal service company, they can be furloughed as long as they're only carrying out their statutory duties and they're on the PAYE scheme. So there are a lot of questions around how do employers go about claiming for these payments, and the portal has still not been set up, but the government have promised it by the end of April. So that does pose a bit of a problem for employers at the moment, because if you're running a payroll during April and the portal is not up and running yet, then you have a bit of a dilemma. Do you pay the money out of your own pocket and hope that you can claim it back, or do you defer the payment? Well, the government certainly doesn't want people to be without money, so I think they will prefer that employers pay the money if they can and then claim it back from the government through the portal. But if you have a furlough agreement that allows you to defer the payment, then you may be able to defer the payment until the portal is up and running and then pay the employees back once you have the money.
Brilliant. Thanks, Emma.
So,
sorry. That's great, Emma. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm finished now. Sorry.
You've covered a lot of stuff. I think there's a lot of announcements that happen over the weekend. So you really clarified that. I think you've already answered some of the questions that have actually come in already. So I'm going to kick off the Q&A session with some of the questions that we received before this webinar, as well as trying to mop up some of the questions that are coming in as well, because they do cover the same areas. So I'm going to pass over to Leslie this question. Hi, Leslie.
Hello. Morning, everybody.
So this question, the staff on our payroll are paid on a simple hourly rate for the work they've performed. They've been furloughed as we are closed, and understand that there'll be a claim based upon some kind of average of previous month's pay. My question is, how do we calculate the amounts that we need to process through April's payroll for submission to HMRC?
That's a good question to start with. They've made it quite simple. It's either the higher of the amount that they earned last year, so in April 2019, or the average of the monthly earnings for the last year. Okay,
brilliant. And Emma, I've got one here. I'm the managing director, but not owner, of a live music booking agency and take the vast majority of my payment as salary. We're in the events industry, so expect a zero cash flow through to the end of summer at the earliest, and our cash reserves are now exhausted. But as an agent, I have to be on hand to administrate the postponement and cancellation of existing bookings and also answer booking queries for events in 2021. Without doing this, my business will have no future and no possibility of future profit. But in order to do it, I have to sacrifice my ability to furlough and then no funds to pay me for my work, so I have to do it for free. Is there an alternative for me under the current government scheme or any prospect of suitable allowances being made by the government down the line to accommodate situations like mine?
It's a very difficult situation. I do empathise with the position that you're in. Obviously, I can't advise you what you should do personally, but the options are you can, as a company director or as an owner of the business, you can take furlough leave and pay yourself the 80% for the 2,500 capped. But it is quite clear that if you do take the furlough leave arrangement, you wouldn't be able to work on the business or in the business beyond carrying out those statutory duties. So of course, if you're having to answer calls and make bookings, that would constitute work and wouldn't be covered under the furlough scheme. The other suggestion would be to look at the loans and grants that are available to see if you're eligible to apply for the business interruption loan or any local government grants. And there is some information on the government portal about what's available for employers. But I'm really sorry to hear about those circumstances, and as I say, I do empathise, but I personally don't have any other suggestions or alternatives at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Emma. So we've got the bank holidays coming up, and we've actually had quite a few questions around this. So I'm going to address this to Leslie actually. How do we pay employees annual leave during furlough? It would be great to know how we should pay staff during this time when you've got the bank holidays coming up.
Well, at the moment, ACAS have updated their guidance and are suggesting that statutory holidays annual leave is paid at full pay, but the government guidance is still quite silent on this, whether annual leave is at 100% or whether it's at a furlough rate. So we're still waiting for statutory rules to come in around this.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Leslie. And then Emma, I think you covered this in your updates already with the new releases that happened over the weekend, but we've got a question here about whether a temporary worker, if they're furloughed, are they not allowed to undertake any other paid work at all? And the same with where the direct employee can if the paid work is outside their contracted hours.
So I guess it depends what type of temporary worker they are. So you can be a temporary agency worker where you're paid through the recruitment agency or the employment agency on their PAY scheme, and you're contracted to work on a client's premises, or whether you employ temporary workers directly on your own payroll. So the new guidance says that where agency workers are eligible, where they are paid via a PAYE scheme and paid either the same rates as they earned this time last year or an average of the previous 12 months earnings. If they're employed via an agency, then it is obviously up to the agency to furlough them and to process their furlough pay. Given the guidance says that there is no restriction on taking a second job, I can't see that they would delineate between a permanent employee and a temporary worker or a temporary employee on that basis.
Okay, thanks, Emma. I think we've had, while we're on the recruitment company front, we've had a few questions that have come in, which again, I think you've answered these already, around commission. So it's saying, you know, with recruitment contracts, recruitment consultants, they earn commission and it's discretionary, but they get it paid every month. Is this not compulsory commission, or is this just what would they not be included in the furlough?
I can't say with 100% guarantee, but if it's part of their contractual earnings and it's part of their remuneration package, then potentially you've got the option to average it. If it's purely non-guaranteed commission, non-guaranteed bonus, then I would say that element of pay is more in question. Where it's part of their regular earnings, part of their remuneration, and it's part of their contract that they earn that commission, I would say it probably falls more into the government guidance than outside of it. But I have to say, I cannot give a 100% guarantee until the regulations are published and the portal's up and running and it becomes clear exactly what the portal will accept. So that's the best answer I can give at the moment, I'm afraid.
Yeah, brilliant. All right, thanks, Emma. And again, I think there's quite a few recruitment companies on the call. We've got another one about temporary workers. So will a temporary worker accrue holiday entitlement on the 80% of their furloughed pay?
Well, the guidance is silent on that matter. What it does say is that employees will accrue their normal holiday during any period of furlough leave. So I can't say for definite how temporary worker holiday accrual would be viewed, but if it's on parallel with the employed workers, they will accrue it for the time that they are furloughed. Okay. But I can't honestly say whether it's at 100% or the 80% because that hasn't been clarified in the guidance either.
Okay, thanks, Emma. And I think we've had some questions around redundancy and furlough. So I'm going to pass this over to Leslie now. If we decide to furlough some employees and then make them redundant, can the furlough be considered the notice period, or do we still need to make the pay in lieu of notice at the end of the furlough period?
Good question. So provided you followed the proper process and served notice of redundancy to the employer, they could serve out their notice period while they're on furlough, but again, it could be argued that this notice should be paid at full pay and not furlough pay.
Okay. And what are the questions we've got here? We've got, do employees still accrue holiday even when they've been furloughed? That goes to Leslie.
Yes, they do. Quite simply, yeah, they do. They employ holiday and service while they're on furlough.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. And this goes to Emma. We've had an ex-employee who resigned and left in March, whose new employer has now pushed their start date back to May. They've asked whether they can be reinstated and then placed on furlough. Is that possible?
Well, the updated guidance on the 4th of April offers a glimmer of hope to those employees that have fallen between the two employments, so both their old employer and their new employer. And it confirms that if employees were made redundant by their employer or otherwise stopped working for them since the 28th of February, they can be rehired by the old employer and placed on furlough leave instead. However, the decision whether to re-employ an employee or ex-employee lies solely with the employer. There is no obligation on them to agree to take somebody back once they have left the business. So the option is, yes, it's possible, but it is up to the employer whether they want to do so or not. The guidance doesn't force you to.
Okay, thank you. And I think we've got a few questions around like the rotation of furlough and staff. So it's like if you've got a number of people in the same role but don't want to furlough them all, how do you select people? Is there a risk of discrimination if we don't have a selection process in place?
Well, there isn't any guidance there isn't any instruction in the guidance as to what the selection criteria should be for furlough leave. It is up to the employer, but it makes sense that if you have a number of staff doing the same job and you need some of them but not all of them, then have some sort of basic criteria in place. And that would give you some form of defence if at some point in a few months' time, when all this has died down, somebody decides to claim that they've been treated unfavourably as a result of being put on furlough leave. Also, you should consider whether some staff would be more suited to furlough leave. For example, carers with caring responsibilities or those who are shielding could be pushed higher up the matrix so that they can take advantage of the scheme. You could ask for volunteers, or indeed you could consider rotating the staff. So whereas the furlough leave is for a minimum of 3 weeks, you could rotate staff on and off to make it fairer for everybody, so everybody gets a turn on the furlough leave. So there's a few options there to try and make it as fair as possible under the circumstances.
Okay, thanks Emma. And another question for you, Emma. Can employers be made to use their accrued holiday whilst on furlough instead of keeping it for when they come back to work?
Well, yes, they can. So an employer can request that an employee takes holiday, but you have to give them at least twice the notice of the leave that you want to take. So, for example, if you want an employee to take 1 week's holiday during a period of furlough leave, you have to give the employee 2 weeks' notice of your intention to force them to take holiday. So, yes, it is possible, but you have to serve notice on the employee to do so.
Okay, thank you, Emma. And I'm going to direct this question at Leslie. If overtime is variable and not guaranteed, should this be included in the calculations?
Well, at the moment, the updated guidance suggests not. Only guaranteed overtime is payable. In other words, where you've got no choice but to work it. So that's where it sits at the minute.
Okay, brilliant. And we've got another question, Leslie. I'll direct this at you again. Are employees allowed to do online training whilst they're furloughed?
Yes, they can. If it's for their own personal benefit, then it's not paid. But if they're undertaking training that they would be doing as part of their role, and it's an employer improved programme, then it should be paid at least the national minimum wage.
Okay. Emma, must we continue to pay the furloughed employee even if they take a second job? I think you've actually already answered this.
Yes, but just to reiterate, the updated guidance this weekend says, yes, you can have a second job whilst you've been furloughed from your current employer, and the current employer can still claim the 80% to pay them. But as I said, if it's in your contract that an employee can't take a second job, it's up to the employer to exercise their discretion whether to waive that contractual clause or not.
Okay. And then I think you mentioned earlier about keeping records for 5 years. What do I need to confirm in writing when furloughing an employee?
Okay, so with the previous webinar, we provided a furlough agreement and a letter. So if the employee has been issued with an agreement, then and they've signed that agreement, then you've got that in writing, and you would need to keep that for 5 years. If you've only issued a verbal arrangement to put your employees on furlough leave, I would recommend that you follow up with a written agreement, ASAP really, and keep that written record for 5 years, just in case the HMRC come back and want to see a written record of who agreed to the furlough leave, and then we've got the records to produce.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. I think this question is actually going to come from me. Is there any chance that we could send those templates out after this webinar?
Yes, so we've updated the furlough leave letter and agreement with the updated guidance, and I'll provide that after the webinar. Okay,
thanks. That's really appreciated, Emma. And I think I'm just going to finish off with one last question before we wrap up. I'll direct it to Emma, actually. I think it's a finger in the air job. When will the legislation be released?
Well, we don't know, and unfortunately I'm not privy to the government's timeline on that, but it should be imminent, because we're already into April now, and the portal is supposed to be up and running by the end of April, so presumably the legislation will need to be passed in advance of that, so it should be any time within the next couple of weeks, but I'm just as keen to see it as you are, so we'll keep our fingers crossed.
Okay, thanks, Emma. I think we're actually running out of time now. We've got loads of questions that have come in. Don't worry, we will get back to you. We'll either follow up on another webinar, or we'll follow up with you in a different format. I'd just like to ask Emma, I mean, you're the MD of HR Service Centre. How can you help SME businesses at the moment?
We've been extremely busy over the last few weeks helping our clients with their various issues around furlough leave, providing advice and guidance and support to the employers at what is an incredibly difficult time for them. So we can keep you updated with the latest guidance. We can obviously participate in these webinars. We can provide the updated furlough agreement and letter, and we can also advise on specific issues by phone and email. And once the furlough leave has ended, there may be issues around having to lay people off or make people redundant, and of course we can assist with those processes as well. So we're very much on the side of the employer, and we want to support you as much as possible during what is an incredibly difficult period.
Okay, thank you. And I think we mentioned before this webinar that you guys have got a special offer going on at the moment.
Yes, that's right. So if you sign up to the Service Centre support services, we'll give you 10% off of the normal fees, and we'll provide the updated furlough agreement and letter, and we've got some updated FAQs, or frequently asked questions, for both employers and employees. So you can issue the employee guidance onto your own staff if you want to. So that's just a little incentive for you to sign up to the services today, and hopefully we'll look forward to supporting you over the next few months.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you, Emma. So just to recap, thanks very much for participating in this webinar. Unfortunately, the time has absolutely flown by. We hope you found it useful. We have recorded this webinar, so we will send out a copy of this following the email. We'll also send out the templates, and we'll send you out more information about the 10% discount that HR Service Centre are offering. If you'd like to talk to any of us offline, then please drop us an email, connect on LinkedIn, or give us a call. We're more than happy to help and support your businesses. And finally, I'd just like to say, stay safe, stay healthy, and we wish you all the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you.